Have you ever wondered how far someone's loyalty can truly go? Imagine this situation. Your daughter, who has always been the center of your life, is far away, and you discover that your own son-in-law, the one you trusted, chose this very moment to make a decision that will change everything. Yes, stories of betrayal can be more complex than simply a mistake. In this account, we'll dive into the shocking and cruel reality of infidelity that happens when you least expect it and when the pain of betrayal mixes with surprise. Who can really predict how far the capacity to deceive can go? This story might reflect something more common than you think. How many times have you heard of a betrayal involving someone you considered part of the family? Perhaps this betrayal is the turning point of a lifetime of secrets and false appearances. Get ready to discover how a simple gesture of trust can transform into a great tragedy. Because, in the end, it's not just about the infidelity itself, but how it reverberates in the relationships around us. Now, imagine how this could affect your life or the life of someone you know. What if the pain of betrayal was never revealed? What if the lies ran much deeper than the mere act of deception? Amid all this, what would you do? The story of a son-in-law and his betrayal of the family goes beyond a simple affair. It reveals something that could happen closer to us than we'd like to believe. The tension had been in the air since the moment they met. Rodrigo, the neighbor, and the narrator were both aware of the instant attraction between them. Though it was clear that both knew what they were feeling was wrong, they couldn't ignore the electricity of the situation. This kind of tension often starts subtly, but when their bodies got closer, the signs didn't lie. The slight touch of an arm brushing against another, the fleeting glances, they all seemed to indicate that something was about to happen, although neither of them wanted to admit it. And it's at this early stage that many get lost. The temptation of novelty, the unknown, the forbidden, emotions start to take over, and reason becomes more and more distant. They knew that this desire was, in some way, wrong, but what do you do when emotions start to dominate and logic fades to the back of your mind? The narrative continues to lead us through this internal confusion, where on one hand, they want to resist, and on the other, they cannot deny the attraction that is about to explode. Now, you may be wondering, how do you protect yourself from this initial tension? How do you control the impulse that might lead to impulsive decisions? The answer isn't simple, but it begins with deep self-awareness. This brings us to a more interesting and complex dilemma. What happens when feelings of attraction can't be ignored and start to overflow? As the days passed, the connection between the narrator and Rodrigo intensified. In the beginning, they were just casual interactions, a greeting, a superficial conversation, a quick smile in the hallway. But over time, these moments started to have more meaning. With every word, the bond between them grew tighter, and the desire that was once hidden began to surface uncontrollably. It's fascinating how, in many situations, small gestures can develop into something much bigger, something you can no longer ignore. The narrator began to feel a whirlwind of emotions she never imagined possible. The growing passion and guilt mixed constantly, as if they were playing a chess game with their own emotions. What is stronger, desire or morality? The game of feelings is a dangerous terrain, and when it starts to turn into something deeper, it can be overwhelming. When the narrator and Rodrigo finally kissed, things changed forever. Passion was no longer a mere attraction. It was something that made the heart race and reason lose its way. But how do you manage these intense emotions? Often, feelings are a reaction to an experience, and controlling that impulse could be key. A practical example is the power of reflection before acting. In moments of intense desire, Taking a step back, questioning your motivations, can help restore balance. Now, the narrator had to deal with the growing strength of this bond, something she knew would bring even deeper consequences. The narrative takes a darker turn as the narrator becomes more involved in an affair with Rodrigo, all while trying to keep up appearances with her husband, João. The secret becomes a burden more and more difficult to carry. It's fascinating how the human being adapts to these situations, starting to justify their actions with little lies, small deviations from the truth, until the weight of guilt becomes unbearable. The narrator finds herself increasingly torn, the love of family and stability beside João, and the irresistible passion for Rodrigo, which intensifies with every encounter. The internal dilemma becomes even more evident. At the same time she feels an overwhelming attraction to Rodrigo, the idea of betraying João weighs on her conscience. But passion speaks louder, and decisions are made in a fog of desire. This is something many experience, isn't it? The conflict between reason and emotion, between what's right and what, in some way, makes the heart beat faster. She knew it was wrong, but the pleasure of the new experience made her forget, for moments, what was really at stake. And this kind of situation is often what makes betrayal so risky. When emotions begin to cloud judgment, people can lose themselves. What would you do if you were in the narrator's place? How could you avoid losing yourself in desire and guilt while keeping your integrity intact? Conscience starts to weigh heavily, and inevitably, choices become harder, more confusing. Rodrigo, aware of the growing tension, didn't take long to start pressing the narrator. Time was running out, and he no longer wanted to live in the shadow of a secret affair. Their encounters, once furtive and cautious, began to grow more intense and demanding. He constantly challenged her, asking her to make a decision. This kind of pressure, which often arises when emotions intensify, tests anyone involved. The narrator, already torn between her husband João and her overwhelming passion for Rodrigo, began to realize that her world was on the verge of collapsing. Rodrigo's pressure became clearer, something that often happens when one party wants more than just a fleeting affair. Rodrigo wanted more. He wanted the narrator for himself, and the ultimatum was clear. She had to choose. This is the crucial point where many find themselves at the edge of their choices. That moment of decision, so delicate, where life can take unexpected turns depending on the option taken. No matter how hard the narrator tried to resist the pressure, she knew she couldn't delay the decision much longer. The attraction was too strong, and Rodrigo's words began to echo in her mind. Now, can you sense the power of an ultimatum? Sometimes, life places us at a breaking point where you can no longer delay an important decision. No matter how much we try to maintain control, the reality of the facts imposes itself. At this point in the story, the narrator finds herself at an impasse, and her actions, or lack of them, begin to define the path she will take. The affair between the narrator and Rodrigo continued, but now the consequences began to become more evident and inescapable. The tension, once seemingly manageable, grew deeper and riskier. Each encounter with Rodrigo was charged with emotion, but also with rising anxiety. The narrator could no longer ignore the weight of her guilt. Her relationship with João, her husband, started to deteriorate, and he, instinctively, began to sense that something was wrong. The uncomfortable feeling of being watched brought a new level of anguish to the narrator. The awareness that João was beginning to suspect left her uneasy. The marriage, once stable, was crumbling before her eyes, and she could no longer escape this reality. Many find themselves in similar situations where the lie becomes unsustainable and the consequences begin to reach what once seemed safe. The pain of a possible discovery, the fear of being exposed, starts to eat away from within, making the situation even more tense. The narrator tried to balance passion with guilt, but the two feelings were colliding violently. And here lies a great challenge. How do we deal with the consequences of our choices? When you opt to follow a path that involves deception, it is inevitable that the truth will come out, sooner or later. In the narrator's case, the most immediate consequence was the distance growing between her and João, and the sense that she was about to lose everything she had. Reflection on the impact of actions becomes necessary at this moment. How would you handle this kind of guilt and emotional pressure? Life doesn't often give a second chance when it comes to such intense choices. The narrator, now immersed in an emotional whirlwind, found herself divided between two worlds, the safe and familiar one, represented by João, and the overwhelming passion for Rodrigo. Doubt raced through her mind at every moment, and the choice seemed more and more difficult to make. How is it possible to love two people in such intense and different ways? This is the central dilemma in many situations of infidelity, where desire and stability seem to be on opposite sides of the scale. The narrator, trying to delay the decision, found herself more lost each day, torn between what she knew was right and what she truly desired. Rodrigo, who had been pressuring her constantly, didn't seem willing to wait any longer. The idea of keeping the secret became more unsustainable, and the narrative intensified as the pressure mounted. The internal conflict of the narrator mirrored her actions and her inability to make a definitive choice. This kind of conflict is common in many situations in life, where emotions cloud reason. When the decision needs to be made, the feeling of a broken heart is inevitable, as if each path carries a loss with it. Now, what do you do when faced with such a painful choice? A good piece of advice would be to stop and reflect deeply on values and long-term goals. Many, when faced with such a conflict, make impulsive decisions, but what truly helps is self-questioning. What do I want for my future? What do my choices today say about who I am? The narrator, while trying to avoid a decision, began to understand that the only way forward was to take a stand, even if it meant giving up something that brought her pleasure, but not true happiness. The encounter between the narrator and Rodrigo reached a new level of intensity. Each touch, each sigh, seemed to amplify the connection between them. Passion was at its peak, and though guilt remained constant, the momentary pleasure spoke louder. The narrator knew that this encounter was filled with risk, but at the same time, it was irresistible. The desire she felt for Rodrigo surpassed any rational concern. This is a point where many find themselves in similar situations. The intensity of the moment outweighs any logic, and reason is easily ignored in favor of an immediate sensation of pleasure. The feeling of being overwhelmed by such intense desire is something that is often trivialized, but it can lead to a series of consequences. The narrator, although surrendering to the moment, knew that what she was doing wasn't simple. Infidelity and betrayal are not just acts of disloyalty. They involve a range of complex emotions that mix together: desire, guilt, pleasure, and fear. In the case of the narrator, this intense encounter with Rodrigo served as a milestone that would change the course of her life. The feeling of living on the edge consumed her. Now, when reflecting on situations like this, it's worth asking, how do you handle moments of extreme intensity? When pleasure and guilt mix, what decision do you make? The narrator, in her search for temporary pleasure, loses herself in emotions. Reflecting on these moments is crucial to avoid being swept away by the whirlwind of feelings. How can you ensure your choices are made with clarity and not under the weight of the moment's emotion? After the intense encounter with Rodrigo, the narrator found herself on an emotional roller coaster. Every time she looked at Joao, she tried to convince herself that nothing had changed. But the weight of guilt was impossible to ignore. The feeling of having given into Rodrigo's desire so viscerally left a deep mark. She felt like she was living in two worlds, and neither of them felt complete. This internal conflict is something many face when dealing with their choices. How do you reconnect with the stability you once had, when desire and guilt are constantly at war within you? Her interaction with Joao became increasingly difficult. He, although still unaware of what was happening, began to notice changes in her behavior. She tried to disguise it, but the tension was palpable. This is when betrayal starts to erode not only trust, but also inner peace. The fear of being discovered and the anguish of having failed in her relationship grew increasingly unbearable. This is something anyone in a similar situation can understand. The weight of wrong choices is heavier than any temporary pleasure. So, how do you deal with this emotional turbulence? When emotions are out of control, the best action is to seek clarity. Stopping for a moment and reflecting on the consequences of your actions can help restore inner peace. The narrator, though lost in her guilt, knew that she couldn't continue living this way. True freedom often comes from the courage to face what is painful and make the right choice. How can you apply this in your life? In moments of emotional crisis, how do you find the clarity to make more balanced decisions? As the days passed, the tension between the narrator and Rodrigo grew. He, already losing patience, pushed her harder to make a decision. Each encounter became more laden with expectations, and the narrator felt that the weight of the situation was becoming unbearable. The dilemma was at its peak. Continue with her husband, maintaining stability, or follow her passion with Rodrigo, accepting the consequences that could come. This kind of pressure is often what leads people to make hasty decisions. The doubt and tension between what is right and what is desired are major contributors to turning a manageable situation into something chaotic. On the other hand, Joao was starting to notice something strange. He saw subtle changes in the narrator's behavior, and her actions began to seem forced, less natural. Though he still didn't know about the affair, his intuition that something was wrong grew stronger with each passing day. He didn't know what was happening, but he felt that something was behind the coldness and unspoken words. This is the moment when the lie begins to be unmasked not by words, but by actions and the energy that radiates between people. And even when we don't know exactly what's going on, the truth always finds a way to surface. In such situations, the key is to recognize the signs before the pressure becomes unbearable. In times of crisis, how do you handle external pressures? The narrator, trying to balance the two worlds, knew she couldn't delay her decision any longer. What would you do in her place, divided between loyalty and desire? The decision to keep a secret can be difficult, but true freedom comes when we face the consequences of our choices. After yet another intense encounter with Rodrigo, the narrator found herself at a point of no return. The dilemma was about to be resolved, and although she knew what was at stake, her passion for Rodrigo spoke louder. The decision was made. She would stay with Joao, her husband, but the desire for Rodrigo would never completely fade. Often, life places us in situations where we must make difficult decisions, where both paths seem to offer something important. The narrator then chose to prioritize the stability of her marriage, but that didn't mean she had abandoned her feelings for Rodrigo. She simply chose to follow a safer line. This choice was not easy, and guilt would accompany her for a long time. The love for João was real, but the attraction to Rodrigo still consumed her. This is the type of emotional dilemma many face, living with the decision they made, but unable to erase what was left behind. The narrator now needed to find a way to deal with the conflicting feelings that haunted her, trying to rebuild what she had with João while the desire for Rodrigo still burned within her. The weight of the decision would weigh on her every day. It's curious how often the hardest choice isn't the one that brings the most happiness, but the one that brings the most peace. By making this decision, the narrator was trying to restore peace in her marriage, but that didn't mean the internal war was over. The real question is, how would you deal with such a decision? When passion and reason collide, how do you ensure the choices you make are those you can live with long-term? Após a decisão, a narradora tentou voltar à sua vida normal, mas sabia que nada seria como antes. A tensão interna não desapareceu. Ao contrário, ela parecia aumentar. O sentimento de culpa, agora mais profundo, tornava a convivência com João uma experiência amarga. Ela se ficava a fingir que tudo estava bem, mas a verdade estava lá, velada, em cada gesto, em cada palavra que trocava com ele. Esse tipo de reconciliação, forcada pela necessidade de manter as aparências, é algo que muitos enfrentam após cometer o erro. A sensação de estar vivendo uma mentira é uma das maiores torturas emocionais que alguém pode enfrentar. João, por sua vez, estava começando a perceber que algo estava estranho. Embora não soubesse exatamente o que estava acontecendo, ele sentia que algo tinha mudado. A desconfortante paz que havia antes começava a se romper, e ele não conseguia entender por quê. As emoções da narradora estavam escritas nas entrelinhas, mas ela tentava esconder-las, convencendo-se de que poderia seguir em frente. Essa reconciliação, que parecia ser retorno à normalidade, estava longe de ser verdadeira. Muitas vezes, tentamos colocar as pecas quebradas de volta no lugar, sem perceber que elas nunca mais encaixariam como antes. Esse é o grande desafio. Como podemos realmente nos reconciliar quando ainda estamos carregando o peso das escolhas que fizemos? A narradora, embora tentasse, sabia que a reconciliação não era processo imediato. Ela precisava lidar com a sua própria culpa antes de tentar restaurar o que tinha com João. A verdadeira cura, nesse caso, viria do confronto com seus próprios sentimentos e da aceitação do que fizera. Como você pode aplicar isso na sua vida? Quando as consequências das suas escolhas se tornam evidentes, o que você faz para buscar a verdadeira reconciliação? Agora que você conhece os detalhes dessa história de Treco, a grande pergunta é: o que você faria se estivesse no lugar do protagonista? Quando a lealdade é colocada à prova e a verdade comica a se desintegrar, é difícil saber como agir. Você tem a coragem de enfrentar os próprios sentimentos e escolhas, ou vai se esconder atrás das aparências, esperando que a verdade se revele por si mesma? O mais importante é entender que a vida não é sobre ser perfeito, mas sobre como enfrentamos nossas falhas e as consequências delas. Pense nisso por momento. Que são as suas atitudes diante de situações complexas como essa? Você é capaz de confrontar os erros? Ou you prefere viver na negação? Deixe sua resposta nos comentários e compartilhe suas experiências ou reflexões sobre como lidar com uma treco tão dolorosa. Se você quer saber mais sobre como lidar com questões de lealdade e confiança em relacionamentos, não deixe de se inscrever no canal e ativar as notificações. Vamos juntos explorar mais sobre a natureza humana e as escalas que definem nossas vidas.